Welcome to AML Conversations, the Solution Series. This podcast series focuses on practical information about solutions to challenges you face in your financial crime compliance program. These solutions include managed services, technology, advisory, and third-party risk management. You can access this series and other AML Conversations and This Week in AML podcasts at our website, amlrightsource.com, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Josh.
Hey, how's it going, Rachel?
All good, thanks. Hi, John. Nice to have you back.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having us again.
Yeah, no problem. So, fun fact, guys, this is our 12th episode, and you've been on the Solution Series for 6 of those. I thought that was a nice little milestone that I just wanted to mention to you both.
That is nice. My goodness, I think we should get producer credits or something.
I mean, they're all yours. They're all yours.
We can put the feather in the cap, Josh. There we go.
Nice.
So in our previous 2 episodes, we've been discussing tuning and optimization. We covered what it is, why it's beneficial for financial institutions. We then took a deep dive into the technical process from a transaction monitoring perspective to ensure systems operate effectively and support a risk-based approach. Today, I would like to explore tuning and optimization as it relates to sanctions and customer risk rating models. I think let's start with sanctions. So what are some of the challenges? How will this exercise differ from transaction monitoring systems? And how can AML RightSource help financial institutions to do this effectively?
Sure. Thanks, Rachel. I'll kick us off on the sanctions side of things, and then we can do some deeper dive on the CRR piece.
Sounds good.
You know, it's interesting because each of these, TM, sanctions, and CRR, from a tuning perspective, they're really incredibly different one from another. So when we think about tuning on the sanctions side, we're really aiming for something very specific, right? Our goal is to make sure that the sanctions filter, whatever sanctions filter you're using, is accurately alerting on sanctioned names from whatever list you're using. But just to keep things simple, let's just assume we're using the OFAC list, right? You can substitute the OFAC list for whatever other list you want to substitute, but just for the sake of example. So when we think about tuning a sanctions model, there are a couple of things that are most important. First of all, the goal at all costs is to avoid a sanctions breach, which is where you have essentially not managed to alert on something that's on one of your lists. If we think about OFAC, there are really 2 main flavors of things on the OFAC list. There are exact names and there are known aliases. So when we look at the performance of a sanctions filter and we think about tuning the sanctions filter, those are always our 2 biggest areas of focus. To make sure that the sanctions filter is capturing 100% of the exact names on the lists, and also to make sure it's capturing 100% of the known aliases on the list. Because if you miss either of those, that's considered a breach. So how do we do that? And what does the process look like for tuning one of these things? Well, it differs hugely depending on what kind of system you're using. So 2 of the biggest systems out there, Fircosoft and Bridger, the way they're tuned and the way they operate is quite different. But essentially, we start by conducting something called match capability testing. We take thousands of names from the lists that you're screening against. We take known exact names and known aliases, but we also mix in a whole bunch of real-world data anomalies. So we'll scramble 2 letters in the name. We'll misspell the name slightly. We'll flip the names back to front so the first name comes last and the last name comes first. So we'll take a bunch of real-world data cases, data anomalies, and we'll test how well your sanctions filter does on all of these. Now, the way most of the big sanctions systems work is they have a number of different algorithms. For example, Fircosoft has 43 different algorithms running. And each of these algorithms, you can set a sensitivity level, meaning what level of match, how many of the letters, how many of the tokens need to match precisely in order for this particular algorithm to get triggered or to alert. So essentially, if you think about it, kind of like what we talked about with TM, there's really 2 main levels. First, you're going to decide which algorithms are relevant for you to have running. Do you need things that look at Cyrillic alphabets? Do you need things that look at Chinese telegraphic characters? there are all kinds of different algorithms that look at different kinds of names written in different kinds of ways. And then for each of those algorithms, you're actually going to set the sensitivity level. Do you want it to need 90% of matching to trigger? Do you want it only to have 80% of matched characters to trigger? And then you can also set its sensitivity level. Sensitivity very high, high, medium, low, etc. So tuning a sanction system generally involves some combination of these bits and pieces, deciding which algorithms you want to have running, what's relevant for the types of lists you're screening against, deciding the threshold level that you want set for each of these algorithms. How precise do you want the match to be before the algorithm says, yes, this looks like a match, and then the sensitivity level. And by playing with these three different levels, you can essentially regulate up and down exactly what you're hitting on and what you're not hitting on. And as always, with any tuning exercise, the real goal here is to make sure that you are capturing true positives, but that you're not getting too many false negatives. So we could ratchet up the sensitivity and ratchet down the percent match so that we would have very little chance of ever missing anything. The problem with that is you're going to get buried in false positives, and you're going to have more alerts than your team can handle. So it's always finding the right balance point between making things sensitive enough so you catch what you want to catch without making them so sensitive that they catch all kinds of junk and therefore create too many alerts. John, anything I left out or that you want to add to that before we move on to CRR?
Yeah, I think a lot of great points, Josh, and just the item about getting lots of false positives, and I know a lot of folks like to create what's called like a good guy list or like a white labeling list or something like that, and certainly that can help with reduction of false positives. But when you create a list like that, those folks don't you just want to make sure that you're reviewing that good guy list, that white list, also on a periodic basis, because the folks that are on that list could change. They could change, relocate, change jurisdictions. Certainly, you just want to make sure you keep those lists updated. And to your point, Josh, that could help with some of the false positives if you have some type of list like that. But you just want to make sure that you also keep that list updated and maintain that list, because folks can be added and removed based on your CDD process.
Yeah, it's a great point, John. And I think that's almost a point we could say is generally true anytime you have either exceptions lists or clean lists or good guy lists or any kind of lists you have. The risk is that they become kind of garbage cans. People throw things in there, they never look at them again. And it's really important to keep those up to date and review them regularly. So with that said, John, maybe you want to dive into the CRR tuning piece a bit, and we can explore that in some more detail.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads right into this, because customer information, customer profiles are always changing. People, like I said, people relocate, people add new accounts, take out new loans. So certainly a lot of changes. Folks get married, have children. Lots of different changes with customer risk profiles. And because it's always changing, it's really important to conduct tuning, as part of your ongoing monitoring plan. And really, I think it starts with that coverage assessment to make sure that you are capturing all the types of customers within your customer risk rating system. You can also look at your risk assessment to ensure that, any inherently high risk customer or all the customer segmentation that was brought out in that risk assessment is also captured within your risk scoring platform. And really, making sure that you also have risk factors that are tailored to each one of those customer types and customer groups that were identified within that coverage assessment. Once you've gotten all those factors, you have all your customer groups. Obviously, the next piece is really to tune and adjust those factors to come up with an optimal and system output. Lots of different ways to tune it. One way you could go through and do a single parameter on a risk factor at a time. You could go in and check a risk factor for, let's say, a PEP. You want to tweak a factor on that on that PEP. So you change the value, you run the algorithm on the data, and then you look at the output of that also. And you can do that, across all of your parameters and factors by changing one, looking at the output, and coming up with some metrics to capture that information. That's kind of a labor-intensive approach. It can be effective if you're a small institution with not, a tremendous amount of customer types and risk factors and things like that to test. I'd say if you have a big population, lots of customer segments, what you could do is build out some meaningful data points and analytics also to help you make more informed decisions on the tuning process. And I think it's a better, maybe not a better approach, but certainly a good approach that you can do when you do that single parameter testing for each risk factor. And for example, a good measure or data point to capture on a customer or relevant risk factor, maybe you just want to determine the number of customers that would trigger each factor. How many customers had a SAR? How many customers have high cash intensive volumes? How many customers have are in certain jurisdictions? How many customers have adverse media? So there's a lot of different types of groups and risk factors that you can come up with, and also creating those as data points. And once you create them as data points, just an example for transaction-based risk factors, you can use what's called standard deviation. So you could create those standard deviations across each customer segment that you're trying to test. And within those standard deviations, create value and volume type of deviation parameters. And then, you could leverage things like scatter plot charts and stuff like that to drop those values in. And then really to start to assess and look at the data points across each segment, which will help you come up with some informed testing and point you in the right direction as to which risk factor is really causing things to be in the high category versus medium versus low. Lots of different types of testing, I think, that can be done, and certainly a lot of different analytics that you can apply to your customer risk factors. And I think it really depends on the type of customers that you're assessing, and also the system that you're using to generate the risk scores. I know, Josh, you're really good into the analytics, and I'm sure you have a lot of stuff to provide here. Just curious to see some of the data points and things that you would test and implement.
Josh, before you answer John's question, out of curiosity, John, what's the ideal cadence for tuning and optimization a customer risk rating model? What would your recommendation be for that?
That's a loaded question. Obviously there's the cadence where there is some guidance on how often you should perform enhanced due diligence on high risk customers, medium risk customers, and also low risk customers. So that's the enhanced due diligence aspect. But to generate those customer groups, it's really your customer base fluctuates all the time, and it depends. Looking at your risk assessment, looking at how that fluctuates. Performing something like this on a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis, or maybe you target a certain customer segment that you want to tune for a certain period, tune that customer segment, and then you move on to the next customer segment. So it's something that can be done, again, as it's an ongoing effort, I think, and it should be broken up, based on obviously resources that you have, and also, if you have any prior issues with your current approach or methodology.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of different ways you can think about the frequency. So some people might just say, hey, this has to be done at least once every 2 years. Why? Because we think 2 years is enough time elapsed that there are material changes likely to have happened that we have to look at again. On the other hand, some people could take a trigger-based approach where they could say, hey, anytime we have material changes to our products or services or customer groups or offerings, then we need to retune the model. So there are certain things that might also inform you how often you might want to tune it. But in terms of the tuning overall, I wanted to jump into that and follow up on what John said, and I actually love tuning CRR models. Of all the different models to tune, CRR are my favorite. And when I think about it really in a few different buckets. On the one hand, first, you want to decide what are the risk factors you want to have included in your customer risk rating model. Are you going to have country and geography? Probably. Are you going to have your products and services? Probably. What about the number of accounts a customer has? Does that matter? Maybe, maybe not. What about their NICS code if they're a business? Sure. Or their occupation if they're an individual? Does it matter? Maybe, maybe not. So kind of the first level is picking the actual risk factors that you're going to have included in your customer risk rating model. The second piece of that is then thinking about the importance that each of those factors is going to have. So let's just pick geography, right? Let's pick country. And that might be your country of residence. It might be your country of citizenship. If you're a corporation, it might be your country of business formation, or it might be where your headquarters are, or a country of operation. There are lots of different things that could feed into country. But let's just imagine that country is one of our customer risk rating factors. Well, when we think about how important country is going to be as a factor, there are two different main ways we can think about it. One way is to say, hey, we're going to take our customer risk rating score, make it out of 100 points, and out of that 100 points, we think that 15 of those points should be allocated to your country. So that should be worth 15% of your overall customer risk rating. That's one way to do it. On the other hand, you could also just assign a number of points. You could say, hey, high-risk customers are more than 400 points, medium-risk customers more than 200 points. For the category of country, we're going to have a maximum score of 50 points because we don't think it's that important. So you could also base your risk factors and how important they are on the number of points they get overall. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to say, hey, which risk factors do we want to have in our model? Which factors do we think are important for determining our customer's risk? Then for each of those factors, you're going to essentially rank it in terms of importance. How important should this factor be in determining a customer's overall risk rating? That's the second piece. And then there's the third piece. So let's stick with this example of countries. Well, if we're going to have country as one of the factors in our model, and it's going to have whatever level of importance it has, however many points it has attached to it, well, then how do we determine how you, John, or you, Rachel, how your country gets ranked within that? Well, there's going to be a lookup table underneath. And that lookup table is going to have every country in the world. And every country in the world is then going to be rated as low risk, medium risk, or high risk. Generally speaking, there might be more categories. And when you see what a customer's country is, we say, oh, Rachel comes from South Africa. So we're going to look up South Africa on that lookup table, and we're going to see whether that's a low, a medium, or a high risk country. And based on that, that's going to determine how many points are assigned to you in your customer risk rating for that specific country field. So we have three different levers we can pull here that we've talked about for the tuning process. First, we could decide to turn factors on and off in the model. We could decide to include new factors, exclude old factors. Second, we can tweak the overall importance or the percentage of your overall customer risk rating score that each of those factors gets. How important is it? Actually, we think geography should be worth 20% of your customer risk rating score, not 15, because that seems to really indicate where our risk is. Okay. And then third, you can affect things by adjusting the underlying lookup tables we talked about. Should South Africa really be considered a high-risk country? Maybe it should be considered a medium-risk country. How do we decide that? There should be some kind of methodology behind it. But again, you've got all three of these levers. You've got the risk factors themselves, the number of points attached to each risk factor, and then the lookup tables underlying a lot of these risk factors. And all of these can be adjusted and tweaked and played with in the process of doing your CRR tuning. So that's kind of the three main buckets that I think of when I think of tuning a CRR model. And I guess last but not least is it's very important to make sure that there's some kind of mathematical logic and consistency across the model. So one of the biggest things I focus on when I start tuning a CRR model is if I see factors that are worth 100 points and I see other factors that are worth 5 points, right away that kind of makes me ask some questions because, hey, the factor that's worth 5 points, it's never actually going to move the needle on a customer's risk rating because the amount of points attached are so small. So is it really worth having it there? So you want to make sure there's some kind of mathematical logic in the model so that the factors in there are really affecting a customer's risk score rather than just creating background noise. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in, and I think it's really important to, when you're selecting those factors, also to ensure that you actually have data, that you capture data for those factors as well. And I think I've seen it frequently where a banking client will use default settings from an AML system provider, and those defaults risk factors, the bank may not even capture the information for those factors. So the importance of having that data available when you're setting up the system is also critical as well, because maybe you want to use occupation for your personal customers, but if you do some data analysis and you only have 10% of your personal customers you have occupation for, and you're missing it for 90% of your customers, then is occupation really a relevant factor, right? And so that's certainly important to ensure, hey, one, you have the right risk factors, but also do you have the data to help drive the calculations? And if you're missing a lot of that information from your customers, then you might have to rethink which factors you're going to apply. Or maybe you go back to your CDD onboarding process to maybe you want to add in some additional data points that you want to capture on your customers to enhance your risk rating methodology as well.
That is a great point, John. And, sort of before we wrap up here, I just wanted to add that while I agree completely, adding a risk factor in if you don't have data for most of your customers on that risk factor, it's kind of meaningless. One other sort of important point before we go is just how we treat null values. Because, hey, there are always going to be some gaps in data. Data is almost never perfect, right? Of course, you want to choose data fields for which most of your customers have data. But let's say you do choose occupation and you have it for 95% of your individual customers, but the other 5 you don't have it for. So how do you deal with that null value? And that's an interesting question to me that comes up in the tuning process also. What we often see is that financial institutions have null values default to 0. And I always recommend that they do not do that. Why? Because if you have null values default to 0, you actually are kind of rewarding missing data. You're kind of saying, hey, if you don't actually have any data for this field, you get a free pass. It's 0. It's no risk points for you. You don't generally want to do that. So, what we tend to recommend is you want to have some amount of risk points attached to null values for all of the factors in your risk model, so that if a customer is just missing that value altogether, they don't just get a free pass. It does add some points to their risk score. And that's kind of the last thing I guess I'll say, because I know we're almost ready to wrap up.
Thanks, Josh. Before we wrap up, do either of you have any final thoughts or closing remarks for this episode, or perhaps the series as a whole?
John, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'll just add in, what I'll add in for any type of process is really the planning and preparation work prior to performing the tuning. I think is critical. Ensuring that you have a good sound methodology, that the methodology incorporates the system that you're going to leverage to perform the tuning, and also clear decision points within that methodology documentation, and really tuning customers and transaction volumes, and there's always a change in your customer base, and I think it should just be part of your ongoing monitoring plan. And if it's not in the plan already, it's definitely something to add in, and then to determine the frequency based on your needs.
And I guess I would I would close by saying that for me, tuning, like so many things in AML programs, I think of it in terms of the 3 Ds. And what are the 3 Ds? First, it should be defensible. Whatever you're doing, can you look a regulator square in the eye and defend why you did that? So first, it should be defensible. Second, it should be documented, right? Because as we've said many times on this show before, from a regulator's perspective, if it isn't documented, it doesn't exist. And last but not least, it should be data-driven. And that's a place where I think people like AML RightSource, like ourselves, can really help a lot, is just with the deep data analysis required to make sure that you're not making sort of arbitrary decisions, but that what you decide is truly data-driven, which obviously then ties back to that first D of being defensible. Because if it's data-driven and you've done your homework and analysis and you can show exactly why you chose the threshold you did, well, that makes the choice pretty defensible. So defensible, documented, and data-driven, those would be my 3 words of advice.
That's great. Thanks, Josh. And thanks, John. It's been a pleasure as always, and I look forward to chatting to you both again soon.
Likewise, Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks for listening to this episode of AML Conversations, the Solution Series. More episodes will be posted in the coming months. If you find this installment interesting, there is more great content at amlrightsource.com. If we can help you with your financial crime compliance needs, schedule a meeting on our website. Together, we can reimagine compliance.